Hello. Hi, everyone. May I have your attention? May I please have your attention? Thank you. Hi, I'm Amala Issa, and on behalf of e-flux, welcome to the opening of Forms of Freedom, an exhibition of the work of the Rojava Film Commune, or Comuna Film Rojava, which will be on view through April 4. It is an honor to be showing their work. The exhibition is curated by iLiana Fokianaki, who is a curator, writer, and educator based in Athens and Rotterdam, and the founder of a very nice contemporary art space in Athens called State of Concept. iLiana has been collaborating with the commune for quite a while now, and iterations of the show have been presented at State of Concept as well as the Galleria Nova in Zagreb. And in addition to the works which you saw in the show, we will be organizing screenings of more films by the commune here at e-flux in the weeks to come, so please stay tuned for these. In parallel to the show, iLiana has organized a program, Art and the Specter of Ideology, and tonight will be the first act focused on Rojava, with guests Janet Biehl, Elif Genc maybe, Laura Raicovich, and Matt Peterson, whom we are honored to have. And tomorrow will be the second act at the Verilist Center for Art and Politics at the New School between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. And it will focus on the wider context of art and ideology with interventions from Marwa Arsanios, Coco Fusco, Amir Husak, Not an Alternative, Christian Niempeta, and the Witch Collective. So thank you all for coming, and now I'm very happy to present the amazing iLiana Fokianaki.
Can you hear me? Yes, you can hear me. Hello, it's really nice to be here. My God, there's a lot of you. I haven't been to New York for 10 years, and that 10 years ago. So every 10 years I come to New York, it seems. Yeah, we have to change that somehow. It's a real great honor to be here, and it's quite moving for me also to have this exhibition in New York for many, many reasons. It's quite special to be able to work with such magnificent filmmakers, and it's quite difficult to describe with words what it is to actually work with such people that work in such conditions that are extremely, extremely precarious and difficult. For those of you that don't know how the Rojava Revolution occurred, I'm just going to give you a little overview. It was about 2012, amidst the civil war in Syria, where Kurdish revolutionaries, together with Syrian, Arab, and other peoples of the region, declared the autonomy of Rojava. This resulted in the foundation of the democratic self-administration of Rojava, which practices a form of stateless democracy based on local governance, gender equality, and communal economy. The democratic self-administration of Rojava, DSA for short, is the self-governing area in the northeast part of Syria, West Kurdistan, and actually Rojava means west in Kurdish. Governed and defended, as I said, by Kurds, by Arabs, and Syriac Christians, as well as other ethnicities living in the DSA, as well as other internationals moving to Rojava. We know of many people from Europe and the US as well having traveled and still being there and working there. The Syrian Democratic Forces, the military force of the DSA, was until recently in alliance with the USA and an international coalition against ISIS, and they have been the most effective force in the war against this terrorist entity in Syria. The self-administration of Rojava bases its policies on the writings of the revolutionary Abdullah Öcalan, whose writings you can actually find also in the exhibition. We made some very short reading list on the table there. Very short indeed, compared to the writings of Öcalan. who initially proposed a model called democratic confederalism, in which principles such as democratic bottom-up self-government, gender equality, and communal economy take a central role. The most remarkable aspect of democratic confederalism is its rejection of the model of the nation-state. I mean, the Kurds, of course, have been, the Kurdish and the Palestinian question are one of the kind of more known ones, and they have been historically separated by the borders of 4 states. So you have Iraq, Iran, Syria, and Turkey. And in all of these states, they have faced structural repression for more than 100 years. And in Öcalan's reasoning, the state, with its colonial and patriarchal heritage, cannot be a solution for the Kurds' quest for self-determination. So instead of fighting for an independent Kurdish state, the Kurdish revolutionary forces propose a decentralized model in which peoples govern themselves, a model that Öcalan describes as democracy without a state. And it's interesting to also add here that the women's forces in Rojava also very abundantly and clearly are against also the Western model of feminist values. So the Rojava Film Commune basically aims to both represent and also put into practice the self-governance principles of the Rojava Revolution. It's a collective that has been born through a revolutionary moment, and it's an artistic practice that really operates on an ideological axis that is informed by the revolution per se, but also by other revolutionary movements. And it's quite interesting to see also the connections that they have with movements throughout the world, Zapatistas being one of them in Mexico, for instance. And the title of the exhibition really formed into my mind because I hope that by seeing the films also you feel that it really translates into a phrase, the actual mandate of the commune, which is to create a lexicon for formulating, for creating the very form of freedom. And it really materializes what Kurdish scholar Dilar Dirik has said as living without approval. There are about 8 works in the exhibition. There will be 2 new films under the extremely difficult conditions that the commune works. And I have to say that some of the films, there are some of the people that really don't live anymore because they have passed away during the recent fights in Syria. So they're not just artists, they're also fighters, many of them. But they tend to be an extremely prolific collective, you know, despite all the difficult situations there. They also have an academy. There is one film from a student produced that you will see downstairs. It's a short film. And I would say, not to kind of give you somehow of a guided tour, but I would start from Stories of Destroyed Cities, which is the most known film of the commune. It has traveled in a lot of film festivals in Europe. It was very difficult for them to understand why would want to show them in an art institution, but they were very open to it. And I think their work, together with other examples of other practices, somehow answers what the artwork can do. And somehow kind of reconnects us with, you know, modern promises of the artwork, that it can have like a revolutionary capacity. It can actually have an agency that is potent. So there are about 8 works. There will be 2 new films actually that are being produced. One was about to be shown, but it hasn't finished. It was supposed to finish now on the 19th of February, but we will show it in the beginning of March. And it's a new film made by women filmmakers that belong to the commune, and it's dedicated on the village of Jinwar, which is a village that was made and run by women. Following a streak of the Rojavan philosophy, which is genealogy, which is the science of women, they call it. And the second film is Berfin, which is again a film that is focusing on the feminist tropes, let's say, of the Rojava Revolution, and it's following the life of a woman fighter. So I only want to make a little note and not to waste more time from a very interesting discussion that we're going to have. To just say that I was extremely honored that e-flux really decided to have this exhibition not because of the political situation that is occurring now with the decisions of Trump. The moment we announced the show in Athens in November 2018, they said, we're bringing this to New York. And I really want to highlight and underline that because I think it was quite a brave decision to do it much before it was, in the front page of the news, and it was kind of a trendy thing to show. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Janet Biehl, who, I'm going to read it as you wrote it, has visited Rojava 3 times and met with members of the Rojava Film Commune. She is the author of Ecology or Catastrophe, 2015, a biography of her late partner, the socialist theorist Moray Bookchin, who has extremely influenced the Rojava Revolution, who died in 2006. She has translated from German several books related to the Kurdish freedom movement, Sara by Sakine Sanchez, which we have downstairs, A Revolution in Rojava by Michel Knapp, and Democratic Autonomy in North Kurdistan by Tatart Kurdistan. She's currently writing and drawing a graphic novel about Rojava. She and her artwork are featured in the forthcoming independent film Road to Rojava, and she lives in Burlington, Vermont. And Laura Raicovich, who is a writer, curator, and art worker focused on the intersections of art and life. She's currently writing a book about museums, cultural institutions, and the myth of neutrality, which we discussed also in a podcast we did for e-flux a couple of days ago, that is published by Verso in 2021. Which delves into how art and museums can contribute to a civic cultural commons. In 2019, she was a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow and the Bellagio Center and recipient of the inaugural Emily Tremaine Journalism Fellowship for Curators at Hyperallergic. Until 2018, she served as president and executive director of the Queen's Museum here in New York, where she oversaw a vital commons for art, ideas, and social engagement. Prior to the Queen's, Raicovich, do you want me to stop? Has held positions at Creative Time, the Dia Art Foundation, Dia Beacon, Solomon Guggenheim Museum, Public Art Fund, New York City Department of Parks. Raicovich lectures internationally and has published a number of books, including Assuming Boycott, Resistance Agency, and Cultural Production, co-edited with Karen Kwoni and Karima Stefan, and The Lighting Field 2017, and A Diary of Mysterious Difficulties. I didn't know about this last book. Okay. And last but not least, Matt Peterson is an organizer at Woodbine, an autonomous space in New York City. He directed the documentary features Scenes from a Revolt Sustained, 2014, and Spaces of Exception, 2018. And since 2014, he has collaborated with Malek Rasamni on The Native and the Refugee, a multimedia documentary project on American Indian reservations and Palestinian refugee camps. And he was a member of the collectives Red Channels and 16 Beaver Group. Okay, thank you all very, very much for being here. I'm going to start with Janet. And your experience with Rojava?
So, yes, I think it would make logical sense for me to go back a little bit because I was asked to talk about the influence of a particular American social theorist, Moray Bookchin, on the Rojava Revolution. So, yes, there is an American connection here. And it's all the more interesting because iLiana's title for this exhibition is Forms of Freedom. And I was really struck by it because that title is very familiar to me. It's the name of an essay that this American social theorist, Moray Bookchin, wrote in 1968. Only a few blocks from where we're sitting now. He was a denizen of the Lower East Side, and he was an anarchist, and he was trying to show that it's possible to have a democracy without the nation state. We think of the state as being democratic in that we elect representatives and they're sent off to some national capital and make decisions for us. But his thesis was that it was possible for people to be empowered in citizens' assemblies and thereby make the right decisions that were right for their communities and their lives without the nation state. So forms of freedom, that term, he meant it to signify that you can't just, the anarchist movement was very inchoate then, and you can't just have like a state of nature or where individualistic anarchists just, people do what they want. You need to have freedom because that immediately leads to tyranny, the strongest person prevails. So you need to have, forms of freedom means you need to create actual institutions on the ground that paradoxically make it possible for people to live in freedom, or maybe better, a concept of social freedom. He looked through, he was trying to renovate anarchism at the time, and he looked through the history of revolutionary movements and arrived at several exemplars that he thought would be in some ways prototypes for these citizens' assemblies, most notably the sectional assemblies that governed Paris during the revolution in the year 1793. It was a new concept because he was also rejecting Marxist forms. He was rejecting a Marxist avant-garde, that Marxist vanguard party, in favor of these grassroots bottom-up institutions. So he's, as I say, it's the first thing I asked iLiana when I arrived tonight was, did you read this essay? And it turns out that she thought that up herself. But it makes sense. I don't think that was an accident. I think there's a logic to ideas that led both of them independently to this amazing term. So I'm kind of getting goosebumps right now at this origin, because as iLiana pointed out, I am also Bookchin's biographer and wrote about the development. The way he went on after 1968 to develop this thesis into a political program that he called libertarian municipalism, in which people could would govern themselves through citizens' assemblies, and then over larger regions they could confederate, right? This was, it worked to have, he looked at ancient Greece, for example. It worked to have citizens' assemblies back then in these very small towns of ancient Greece. The men of these ancient cities met and made decisions even during wartime. They governed themselves. But there were some problems with that. First of all, it's very small. It's men only. It's men only. It was property, men only, and you're up on Greek stuff.
Everyone in terms of Greek democracy.
All right.
It's dictatorial.
And also non-Athenians, non-citizens were excluded, and and then he, as I said, he also was looking at the Parisian sectional assemblies of 1793. He looked at the New England town meetings, and in every historical instance there were problems, like the New England town meeting. Again, it was both men and women, but they were conducting genocidal wars against Indians at the time. And in the Parisian sectional assemblies, there were some guillotines and a lot of blood was being shed. What Murray did was take these historical examples and say, look, let's just look at the institution. Let's look at the form of freedom. Yeah, there's a lot of bad baggage, historical baggage attached to every single one. But let's just rescue the ideology itself. Because, we don't have to lead genocidal wars against Indians anymore, and we can include women, and we can have it open to everybody. So that his contribution was to develop this ideology to rescue face-to-face democracy from the slaughter bench of history, essentially. And he looked for governance over larger areas. He looked to the Spanish anarchists. They had an anarcho-syndicalist union called the CNT. And he was fascinated by this organization because it consisted of like local units where people discussed things and made decisions. But then it was a bottom-up system, so that the local units would send delegates to a council on the next level up, maybe for a council for a neighborhood or a city. And then that council, that neighborhood or city council, would send delegates up to the next level. And these delegates are not the same as representatives. He was very anarchist are very careful to make this distinction because these delegates are mandated and recallable. In other words, all they do is transmit the wishes of the base up to the next levels of the confederation, as opposed to representatives who you just elect. We elect someone to represent us in a national capital and then they make decisions regardless of what we think back home. So it was a way of ensuring that power flows from the bottom up. And as I said, after '68, he continued to develop this idea that he ended up calling it libertarian municipalism, and barnstormed around the United States and Europe and Canada to try to build a movement based on it. But since many of you have never heard of it, you understand that it wasn't all that successful. And by the time he died in 2006, he was a disappointed man. But he could have, I so wish that he had stayed on, he had hung on for a few years longer, because it turns out that his books had been translated into Turkish, and they were read by Abdullah Öcalan, one of the co-founders of the PKK and basically its principal figure. Mr. Öcalan had been the subject of an international manhunt in 1999. He was captured by the CIA and the Mossad and a lot of...
The Greek embassy in Kenya, actually. This is one of the guilts that the Greeks carry.
He was put on trial and tried for, I think, treason and convicted, sentenced to death. But at that time, Turkey was trying to enter the European Union, and the European Union said, if you want to be part of us, you can't have capital punishment. So no death penalty. So they commuted his sentence to life imprisonment, and they imprisoned him on a little island in the Sea of Marmara, which is one of the seas near Istanbul. And he's, like, there's 1,000 guards, but other than that, he's usually the only prisoner, although sometimes others come and go. And he's been there since 1999, and he's still there now. So, yeah, you can imagine. He did a lot of reading because he wasn't allowed to have many visitors. He could see his lawyers sometimes, but not even them very often. Flagrant human rights violation. And he asked the comrades, or the friends, as they're called in the Kurdish movement, to send him writings by social theorists, Western social theorists, Middle Eastern social theorists, because he realized at the time that the movement had come up against a kind of an obstacle, that it was hard to see how the PKK could achieve its goal of creating an independent nation state called Kurdistan. And he began to think that maybe that wasn't such a good idea anyway, because it would just form another nation state. And he read a lot, I guess some Bookchin's works in translation were in, I think of it as a box, a box of books that were sent to him from the comrades via the lawyers to the island in the Sea of Marmara. And he read these, and apparently he was quite taken with Murray's writings about libertarian municipalism. And if I can just, I mean, I'll tell you the way I imagine it. I don't know how, please, I wasn't there, so I can't tell you. But he must have seen that since the Kurdish people were not going to have a nation state, they could have bottom-up democracy in similar ways that to what Bookchin had described. And he was very taken with this concept and he recommended it to the PKK. And from 2000 to 2005, there was a big debate that went on within the movement about whether to accept this. Can we really give up the dream of independent Kurdistan? Can we really give up Marxism? Can we really do that? But apparently some of the younger people in the movement, especially women, were very much in favor of it. And by 2005, they ended up adopting this idea, and I don't want to say it's purely Murray's idea, not at all. He reworked it in his own way. I can talk a little bit about some of the differences if you want to hear about that later. But he called it democratic confederalism or democratic autonomy, and the PKK adopted it. Now, this is not, they didn't just adopt it and put it on a shelf and admire it. They didn't send it off to the universities for people to have lots of debates and discussions about it. They didn't send it off to periodicals to have debates. No. When they arrived at the right ideology, after fine-tuning it and shaping it down, they they set about doing an amazing thing, implementing it. So they take theory very seriously as something that it had to be put into practice. And so they started creating democratic institutions, communes, councils, committees in Turkey, in southeastern Turkey, where most Kurds live, in northeastern Syria, and also northwestern Syria, let's not forget Afrin. With greater or lesser degrees of secrecy, because of course Turkey and Syria at the time were brutal dictatorships, and so you couldn't really do this very well out in the open. So a lot of it, the organizing was illicit or underground, and the organizers, especially in Turkey, were subject to arrest and persecution to the point that they really couldn't move forward with it very easily. In Syria, it was a slightly different story, because as iLiana pointed out, in 2011, the Arab Spring reached Syria, and then there's basically the Syrian civil war began, and it basically evolved into two sides, into the supporters of the Assad regime on the one hand, and then the forces that were originally for pro-democracy ended up quickly taken over by jihadists. And so it was a war between two sides that really didn't care a fig about Kurdish rights. So the Kurds said, we don't like either of these approaches. We don't like the Assad dictatorship, because look how they brutalized us and tortured us in their prisons. And we don't like these crazy jihadists either. So we're going to go our third way. And so they kept using that word when I was there. We picked the third path. And this third path was democratic confederalism. And so by the time, in July of 2012, the Assad forces withdrew from northern Syria. They needed to go down and fight the jihadists in the south. They just couldn't do two fronts. So they withdrew from northeastern Syria and from Afrin. And that just, I think of it as like that Leonard Cohen song, the crack is where the light comes in, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact quote, but yeah, the cracks are where the light comes in. And so, yeah, in this cleavage, there was a governing vacuum, and that's how these grassroots democratic institutions that had been painstakingly constructed underground since 2005, they became the polity. They became the self-administration, the self-government of northeastern Syria and also Afrin in the northwest. And one of the remarkable things one of the gratifying things about it is that the people were so thrilled to be able to actually participate politically after so many decades of brutal dictatorship, that they were rushing into the councils, the neighborhood councils. That was the first unit, the base unit that was originally formed, the neighborhood councils. But the meetings got so crowded that they had to form another unit underneath, a base unit below the base unit at the level of the residential street or block, and those are what came to be called communes. And they're the base unit. And once again, it followed the model. They followed the model of sending delegates from each of the communes to a neighborhood council, and then the neighborhood councils would meet, and they would elect delegates up to the city or district level, and then they would send levels up to the cantonal level. And the effort was to make sure that the decision making came up from the base. So I have to say, I was Murray's partner for 19 years. He never dreamed that this could happen where it did, the way it did. But I don't want to say that it's perfect, but this is certainly on paper, the way it developed. I have to also say, before I turn the microphone over to Laura, who's waiting patiently, that one of the great innovations that Mr. Öcalan made in creating democratic confederalism was to insist that women must be liberated, insist on the liberation of women as part of this process. Bookchin himself, he as an anarchist, he said, I'm opposed to all hierarchy. And he didn't really distinguish one from the other. He's opposed to gerontocracy, he's opposed to racism, he's opposed to sexism, he's opposed to the nation state. He said, I'm opposed to all hierarchy. But Öcalan singled out the liberation of women. He singled out patriarchy, and he said, this is a huge obstacle that we have to overcome. And so he insisted that women, and I'm sure he had a lot of pressure from women too in the movement, so I don't want to say, maybe idea didn't just come out of nowhere. But he insisted on the liberation of women, and you know, that in itself is a democratizing force because they're half the population, you know? I mean, so that in itself, I think, has been one of the kinds of the cements for this kind of that keeps this system going, because women were liberated. They had to, you know, once the Rojava Revolution was instituted, polygamy was banned, so-called honor killings were banned, childhood marriage was banned. A lot of these ways that kept practices that in the area that kept women benighted for so long were abolished, and women gained on paper the freedoms to have all the freedoms that men had. The movement set up women-centered, battered women's centers, malajin, houses of women, and made sure that every woman in the cities and the towns knew, even if she was Arab and thought she's not allowed to be liberated, they knocked on doors and made sure every woman knew that there's a battered women's shelter in town if you need it. And you can go vote if you need it. You can work with us if you need it. You can become a healer if you need it. You can do anything. You can participate politically. You can come to the commune meetings, and yeah. And I have to say, the last time I was there, April 2019, I met with a woman called Amina Ossi, who's yeah, she's very, very high up in the administration now, in self-administration now. But I asked her what her projects had been before she just got this job in the administration. She said, you know, I'm working on in the liberated areas, the Arab areas liberated from Islamic State, in Deir ez-Zor, in Raqqa, in Tabqa, and I've established a women's academy in each one. And I said, well, what do they teach? Is it like YPJ training? No. What do they teach? Is it genealogy? No, that's part of it. So I went and visited these women's academy, and what they teach them in these 20-day sessions is that women can participate in democracy, they can rule themselves, they can overcome the mistakes of the past, they can go to their commune meetings, they can empower themselves. And I tell you, I went to the graduation, and by that time, you know, it was, as Amina told me, she said, after pressure, the explosion. These women were raring to go. Or if they didn't feel they could participate themselves, a lot of them told me, we are going to make sure our daughters know that they can do this. So I think that project of educating, and especially Arab women, it was problematic at first. I saw a lot of progress made there, and I also saw a lot of progress made in terms of interethnic solidarity. But I can talk about that later if you want to hear about it. I gotta give up the mic now.
Just a few notes from my side. You said something that really struck with me. You said that Maury thought that it's very, very important that we rescue ideology itself. I thought that was a really beautiful phrase, because the problem many times is, as you described, ideology kind of transferring from desk to desk, from university, and never being actually, unfolded and implemented, becoming practice, and just staying in the, in the imaginary. Let's say this is one thing that struck me from what you said, and I just wanted to make a small note that also, of course, when it comes to the very small neighborhood councils and assemblies, there is always a rule of a man and a woman equally sharing power. Therefore, the delegates that will go to the next step and to the next step, it's always one man and one woman. It's never two men, or it's never two women. So I think that's also one. Let's say it's symbolic in many ways, but it's actually very pragmatic in the sense that they are able to exercise the exact amount of power that their male counterparts has, which I thought was important. But I also wanted to ask, before you pass the mic along, how did you meet the Rojava Film Commune?
Oh, so I met them in Amuda in the year 2015. They had just started it a couple of months earlier. I think it was founded in July of 2015. And there was a showing. There was a showing of a movie by Charlie Chaplin called The Kid that we went to see after the meeting. And why The Kid? Why? It was the first movie to be shown in the Northeast since the early 60s, because there are no movie theaters. There are no cinemas in the area. After 62 was the last time a movie was shown, and it wasn't that movie. It was some other movie. But in 1962, in Amuda, which is a little town on the border between Turkey and Syria, the Hafez Assad, this is the father of Bashar Assad, who was in power then, he had insisted that all the local children, all the local Kurdish children had to go into this cinema to watch this movie, I guess for indoctrination or something like that. And so they were all crowded into this little cinema, and the projectionist warned the people who were organizing it, this film can overheat, especially if we're showing it over and over again. The film can overheat and there might be a danger, but the organizers insisted, no, you have to go ahead and show the film. And somehow the doors were locked and the thing caught fire, and I think 250 children were burnt to death.
168. Yeah.
168? Okay, sorry. So I don't know where I got that number from. But anyway, so it was such a crisis and so devastating that Kurdish people couldn't bear to go into movie theaters for a long time. So when in 2015, when I was there around the time of the founding of the Rojava Film Commune, the movie they chose to show was Charlie Chaplin's The Kid, as an homage to the children, to the dozens of children who had been burnt to death in Amuda all those years before. So.
Just to also add that one of the aims of the commune is to rebuild the cinema that was burned. I mean, they're trying through screenings and through fundraising to actually reinstate the cinema. But there's also one other reason as well, apart from that. It's also that older Kurdish people could not read subtitles. So silent films was a very, very obvious way of actually, attracting audiences to cinema in order for them to be able to follow the plot. Just to give a little, and I want to go to Matt before we go to Laura, to ask also what was your first encounter with the commune, and of course, mainly because you're coming from film. What was also your first impression when it comes to the practice of the commune?
Yeah, I think to talk a bit about my own relationship to the whole movement, really, I've been involved in autonomous politics and movements for the last 10 or 15 years, primarily through Woodbine, a space we run in Ridgewood, for the last 6-7 years. And I think, like many of us in the room, in October 2014, during the resistance in Kobani, is when we first started to really get to know about the Kurdish movement in Syria. And the first resource that we had available was a book Janet translated, which was the Democratic Autonomy in Northern Kurdistan, which was mostly about the Kurdish movement in Turkey. But it was really the only book available in English that I'm aware of at that time that really talked about the experiments of democratic autonomy that the Kurdish movement had taken after Öcalan's imprisonment. So I just want to thank Janet for all of her work in translating this movement and this history and Öcalan's words and Sakina Genc's words and et cetera. So shortly after reading about the movements, I was doing work for a long time about refugee camps, refugee movements in Palestine. And I was in the region in early 2015, so just a few months after. So of course, maybe recklessly, we were like, let's go to Kurdistan. Let's go to Rojava. Yeah. But one of the things that's interesting to think about now, it's February 2020. This was a number of years ago, and I think for a lot of people in radical movements in the United States, we didn't know anyone who had been to Kurdistan. We didn't have those links like people have with the Zapatistas or Palestine. Those links didn't exist. Those solidarity movements didn't exist, and there wasn't really a lot of communication between so-called radicals in New York City and the Kurdish movement here. So this was something we really had to kind of build from scratch and figure out. So when we were first like, we want to go to Kurdistan, we didn't know how. We didn't know where to go, or who to talk to, or who to meet, or who to email. So we really had to figure it out. So in January 2015, we met people and we flew to Diyarbakir, and it was at a time with the Kurdish movement in Turkey was quite open. The peace process was kind of still functional. People were very cooperative, very talkative. We could arrange meetings, we could talk to people, we could find translators. And it was January was right around the time that Kobani was being liberated. So everyone was like, you have to go to Kobani. So we went to Suruç right around that same time, which is the border town of Kobani on the Turkish side. And we stayed for a week for free in the Suruç Cultural Center, which was later bombed by an ISIS suicide attack. But we stayed for a week for free. No one asked us for any money. They fed us for free. And we were just waiting to go to Kobani, and unfortunately we weren't able to. So when I came back at that time, that's when I really reconnected with the Kurdish movement here in New York, or in the metropolitan area. A lot of people live in New Jersey, a number of whom are here tonight, actually, including Julia, who I want to just mention, Julia Kartal, who's been organizing a Kurdish cultural and film festival for the last 3 years. She's there in the back, who's very helpful to me and a lot of people here in New York City to doing this work. So at that time, we organized something called the North America Rojava Alliance, which was an attempt to build some of these solidarity connections and kind of deepen the relationships between kind of people here in New York City or the US and the Kurdish movement in Turkey and Syria. Then about a year later, I was back in Palestine and Lebanon doing the film project that I've been working on. And we thought, okay, well, now we have to try again. You know, we're back in the region, we're gonna try again to go to Rojava and go to Kurdistan. But this time we knew to go to Iraq. So we flew to Iraq this time. And yeah, through Amina Osei, actually, who I think at the time at least was the Minister of Foreign Affairs or something like this. Yeah. So she was very helpful, and we explained what we were doing and who we were, and she sort of helped us figure out how to get across. This was then January 2016. And I think around that time is when e-flux actually published a text about the Rojava Film Commune.
Guido's text. It was an interview, or was it Jonas Dahl?
Maybe Jonas's. I think that might have been the first time I had heard about the Rojava. I was trying to think how I first heard about it. It might have been this text.
No, it was Jonas because he was there between September and December 2015 the first time, and it was exactly as Jonas says. It was July 2015 that it was founded. Therefore, it was the first kind of also. Let's say tours in quotation marks that they were doing throughout the area to also try to get people to join the commune, together with internationals, which we didn't mention, that were also international people joining the commune that have helped, like Alejandro and several other.
So I think we knew it existed before we went. I think might have been from that text. So when we went, we crossed. I remember there was this really strange kind of surreal anecdote where the Iraqi Kurds control the border on their side and the Syrian Kurds control the border on their side, neither of which are really official in a way. It's not an official border crossing, really. So I remember this Iraqi Kurdish woman, we presented our fake press passes that we made in a copy store here. We're like, we're press, we're real journalists. And she said, okay, you know, I'll give you permission, but you can only go once. And we're like, okay, you know, we can only go to Rojava once. And then we get into this little rickety kind of motorboat that's basically the size of the stage. And it felt kind of like a Greek myth or something that we cross this river.
Be careful, it's death that is on that boat. So.
Right. We crossed this river into Mesopotamia on this little rickety, you know, motorboat that we can only go one time to the utopia of Rojava. Yeah, and we were like, shit, maybe we shouldn't come back. We should just stay. They're only gonna let us in once, you know. But when we went, one of the things we knew when we went, I went with my partner Malik Rasamni, who's Lebanese, so he speaks Arabic, which made it much easier because everyone in Rojava speaks Arabic, maybe 90%, because they have to learn it in schools, basically. So that made it a lot easier to kind of go around. But we knew what we didn't want to focus on was the military aspect, because that's mostly what the news focuses on, is the war. And, you know, what is the YPG doing? What is the American military doing? What is ISIS doing? And we're like, that's covered. You know, we want to focus on the civil society and the cultural and the kind of...
Just to give a little asterisk also, which is one thing that I really admire very much on their side, is that the Western media has very much fetishized, particularly on the women fighting, fighters in Rojava. So we have had like tons and tons of spreads in magazines and newspapers throughout these 6 years, and it's the worst that can happen for them because they really, abhor this kind of neoliberal way of seeing and fetishizing on the woman fighter. So just to say that, of course, that period in particular was the period of all these Kurdish Angelina Jolie coming in, in the New York's magazine and all these things. Just a little note.
So what we wanted to do was focus, well, we didn't totally realize it at the time, but what we ended up focusing on was the academies, which were by far the most experimental, progressive, forward-thinking, intellectually sophisticated, deep, revolutionary things happening in Rojava, I felt and still feel in many ways, were these attempts to really rethink pedagogy and involve the whole of society in these projects. So the three that I remember mostly that we focused on were the Genealogy Academy, the Women's Academy we went to, the Mesopotamia Academy, which was more of the philosophy, the theory academy, if you will, and the Film Commune. And we knew that those three existed, and we were taken there, and we did interviews, and we stayed there. One of the things that I think was striking about them also, in terms of schools, or in terms of how we think of schools or institutions, is they all function like communes, where it's the entirety of life. It's not like they go there, from 9 to 5 or 9 to 3 and go home. People are living there often in these places. They live in these buildings. They kind of stay there. And a big part of what they're doing is also learning how to reproduce themselves, where they're living communally and they're cooking for 20 or 30 people. So you have teenagers who are studying film, but they're also learning how to cook for 20 people, which is really interesting, especially the men who also have to learn to cook, which, they didn't know how. They were never so this was really kind of striking, and they talked about that also. It wasn't just about film and the film or in the Mesopotamian Academy. They also talked about how this process of socialization, basically, or kind of remaking the entirety of a kind of mentality is sort of how they talk about it or think about it with those three academies. One other thing I can say about the Film Commune is one of the things we also wanted to do was, or we were invited to do, was to show our work. So we didn't just talk to them or interview them. They invited us to screen it because they were having foreign filmmakers come or foreign artists come. So they're like, let's see your stuff. And we had it subtitled into Arabic. So we showed them 3 films, one of which was made with Adam Khalil, who I know is a friend of the space, about the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Another one we showed was an older Palestinian film from the mid-70s called They Do Not Exist by Mustafa Abu Ali, which was made in Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War, which was about the beginnings of the Civil War. But it was also made by a film commune, by a film collective, a Palestinian film collective. And we spoke to them about the work, which was also really interesting. And I remember who came, so they advertised that, we're gonna have a screening, and there was like maybe a dozen YPG fighters, like soldiers came, a bunch of grandmothers, some children, like 7-year-olds, and maybe like a dozen or so of the students. So it was very kind of bizarre, eclectic, audience, not like the e-flux audience, So we were like, fuck, these soldiers are watching our, I wonder, and then we had a Q&A, or I wonder what they're gonna ask us, what are they gonna say? And it was really interesting to also connect the Palestinian experience to the Kurdish movement, because obviously the Palestinians helped train the PKK initially when they were kind of thinking about armed struggle, but unfortunately I think a lot of those connections have frayed over the years, and there's not as much of a dialogue, it's being revived in some ways. So this was something we spoke about, and we had really interesting discussions about the work. But the last thing I'll say is we didn't actually see any of their work when we went. We saw a mural of Charlie Chaplin in the building. Oh, one of the things, Jonas Stahl, in one of the articles, because I was rereading them the other day, he wrote about the Film Commune. He described Rojava as a big squat, or a giant squat, which was interesting because territorially it's maybe a giant squat, but also all the buildings or all the academies are themselves just squats, because it's not a state, there's not an official revolution. Basically, they just took over buildings, not so dissimilar to the Lower East Side, ABC No Rio or something.
And just also, I think what is extremely interesting is the way that there are very DIY signals made to kind of override the Assad regime's signifiers or signs or, you know, logos. And then you have over, you know, the three colors of the revolution, or, you know, logos from the commune, or like little handmade posters, like the ones, for instance, that we have downstairs. And I just wanted to make also a note on, you mentioned the Mesopotamian Academy, which is very much one of the films that we have downstairs, The Lonely Trees, which really describes how they conceive the legacies of cultures that are of the region, and how they interact with one another, and how they stem from one another in many cases, which I think is also really one part of how Rojavans really conceive and understand culture as an amalgam of several different traditions. And another aspect of the Mesopotamian Academy was also, from what I understand, also Jonas described it to me, was the creation of fake archaeological items. I don't know if you, yes, trying to imagine. So there was like a morphology of a once, you know, a culture that we have not seen yet, of trying to kind of recreate what has never existed, which I also thought was extremely interesting, because there, ideologically speaking as well, it's creating a narrative through the cultural artifact as well, which is constructed, but it doesn't matter because it actually looks very real.
Yeah, two anecdotes about the Mesopotamia Academy, or quickly, is when I went there, they had two banners up. One was Nietzsche. They had a big Nietzsche banner. Another one was Adorno. And it was the quote from Adorno, "The wrong life cannot be lived rightly," in Kurdish. And I was like, okay, you know, I'm from New York City, and I could never imagine seeing that at an educational institution, you know. So it kind of places you where you are. But basically, they're big squats. You know, these buildings, I think the film commune was some kind of municipal, maybe it was a theater or cultural building or something that they just took over with permission from the self-administration. It wasn't totally anarchic, you know, there was some kind of, but the people were quite young. They were in their early 20s, you know, they were quite young. The students were teenagers, basically. And they were really kind of making it up. They weren't necessarily like professional, you know, film people exactly. So there was a really spontaneous, informal kind of way that they were conducting themselves. But like I said, I didn't actually see any of the films at that time. The first time, I think then it was the following year, in September 2017, a friend, Eric Foreman, had written to someone at the Film Commune and said, "Oh, do you have any films that you can show that are subtitled?" And they had sent him a disc or some files or something. And there was a screening that was organized with Paper Tiger, which was a pioneering video collective, radical video collective from the early 80s. So they kind of co-presented the screening. And the films weren't at all what you would expect or what I would have expected. And there was a clue when I was in Amuda, which is where we stayed when I was traveling in Rojava. I met a German guy who had since joined the guerrillas and was killed. But he said, I was talking to him about the Kurdish media and Kurdish representation, and he said, if you look at the Kurdish images on like their television stations or their propaganda images, so to speak, you never see them fighting. The guerrillas, they're either singing, they're dancing, they're cooking, there's food, it's them living, but you never see them like heroically blowing something up. Like, you know, other kind of propaganda images, and I never thought about it, I never noticed it. And then when you're traveling around, they have these TVs around that are showing images, and it's true, you know, the guerrillas, whenever you see the guerrillas, they're kind of just cooking around a fire, they're braiding each other's hair or something like this. So when finally we saw the Film Commune films here in New York, they were all these family tales. They were like, it was watching Ozu films. It was like a film about a father and his daughter, and they're disagreeing because she wants to learn an instrument, was one film I saw. There was one film where the kid was lazy and sleeps late, and his parents were trying to get him to wake up. They're all like these moral kind of tales about how families, and we were shocked and we were amazed, and they were so beautiful because they weren't at all the kind of revolutionary political films of like, we're gonna beat ISIS, or we're gonna, whatever, you know, have our own, it was like, how do families talk to each other? And I was like, this was in 2015 and 16, all the films that I was seeing that I think it was the first batch of films that they produced together. And this was also the heart of the conflict with ISIS, the most intense fighting with ISIS. And it was so amazing that in that context, they were like, I'm going to make films about dealing with my family. And I was like, wow, this also revealed just how revolutionary the mentality is about the film commune and the kind of culture there to think that that would be what they would be producing. And just lastly, you know, there's this whole idea of stateless democracy or something, but I was thinking about this idea of like stateless cinema, or what that might mean or what that might look like, because when you think of revolutionary cinema or propaganda films, you think of Soviet films or the Cuban films. And there is a Cuban film actually in '67 where it's called Por Primera Vez, it's the first time, so they were similarly showing Charlie Chaplin films in rural villages in Cuba because they're silent, you know, so you don't need language, and to people who had never seen a film before. But I was thinking, you know, those revolutionary films are done from the state down. You know, the state is dictating what the propaganda is, and here in the Rojava Film Commune, you have people in their 20s or teens imagining what to do, and I think that interesting switch or dynamic is what's reflected, and I think downstairs you can see the kinds of films that they're producing is just completely different.
There is one last film which we haven't seen because it's touring in cinemas, which is very much in the fighting mode, but it's the only one, I have to say. And yet again, there is a moral tale within that film, and the more approach is how does a small brigade interact with one another, and you know what are, you know, let's say the lexicon of the camaraderie between them, rather than how to trick Turkish soldiers, which is actually a true story. But I think this this idea also of the stateless cinema is extremely interesting that you propose, because again, obviously, in the exhibition we have a shelf with some of the books that you can actually see in the academy, which were mainly translated in Arabic, and the process of teaching is of translating on the moment in Kurdish and discussing afterwards. And I personally was quite amazed with the selection of these books, because it's from Parajanov to Fellini to Tarkovsky to you know, Akira Kurosawa, and I was thinking that it's a wonderful way of actually collecting world cinema in order to create a new stateless language about cinema that kind of filters it through your own understanding and through your geopolitical location.
Yeah, they also didn't make documentaries, which was the other radical thing, which you sort of take for granted. They're all fictional films. They're all kind of, there's people acting or writing stories which you wouldn't necessarily expect when you think about a revolutionary film collective. You would think they're making documentaries, propaganda pieces, essay films, and they're all these narrative, short essay, moral tales or something.
Yes, and also this, in terms of the moral tale and the ideological part of the film, this is also what is interesting for me, and why initially I was like really keen on having an exhibition like that, and to also address the title of our discussion today, of how difficult it is from someone that is used to Western cinema, or let's say in quotation marks, the tropes of Western cinema in that sense, to perceive or to be open to filmmaking that comes from this position, which is very much through an ideological axis, whereas actually for the last 100 years we have been consuming Hollywood films that half of them are funded by the Pentagon, you know, and it's a blatant propaganda that comes from the U.S. How, you know, always U.S. soldiers are the nice guys and they really want to, you know, save the world, and this is very normal for us. But when it comes from the other side, then it takes kind of an ideological position that we are. It's difficult for us to understand, or it's foreign somehow. And to jump to Laura with that, I mean, then again, of course, the question goes to what is the role of an art institution, an art space, a museum, or an independent organization like e-flux or State of Concept or whatever, in facilitating this type of work. And of course, we also discussed it a little bit in the podcast, but for those that will not hear it until the next month, I think it's nice to also get your perspective on this book that you're writing, which is very much related with this question, I think, of how the institution, in fact, is always complicit somehow, and it's never a neutral space.
Yes, indeed. This is kind of my obsession. My deadline for my book is next Friday, so I'm really deep in. But just to back up a little bit, I have to say two things. One is that, thank you, iLiana. This is really a wonderful opportunity to talk and listen about this work, which has been so influential in my thinking. Through Jonas, I became familiar with what was happening in Rojava, particularly through the invitation that he received to actually design the public parliament building in Rojava. And while I didn't make it to Rojava, I had thought about going at a certain point when it was possible for people to go, and there were these kind of tours, delegations that were visiting. But then things quickly changed, and so it wasn't possible anymore. But I was able to go to the embassy that Jonas set up in Oslo. And I can't remember what year that was. That was in like 2016, yeah. And that was remarkable for a number of reasons. One was that there was this huge Kurdish community in Oslo that came out full force to kind of celebrate the moment. And it was it was complicated time, but also very hopeful. And the conversations that were had about this particular mode of self-governance was so moving. And unfortunately, a number of the people who I met during that period have now died, given their fighting in the war. And unfortunately, more recently, due to the recent decisions that the Trump administration has made. But in any case, I tell you that just because it has really, what has happened and the kind of evolution of thinking that's happened in Rojava, I think has a lot, calls to us, particularly in this moment in time in the United States. I think it's a place of deep learning, and to me, one of the really interesting aspects of what it could mean for cultural space is the question that I keep coming back to, which is how cultural space can be more useful to us. And that always leads back to a question of, well, what are our expectations of, and what do we collectively desire our cultural spaces to be? Because, you know, we have these unacknowledged ideologies that are embedded in cultural space and how they've formed and the history of how they've evolved. And as you said, as we were talking about, I've interviewed a number of people for my book, including Rebecca Solnit, and she made this funny comment about how, you know, it's ideological to not buy a car because of its environmental impact, but it's not ideological just to have a car. And so ideology shows up in the exact opposite of where it's most problematic, when it's hidden. And, you know, my book is really about kind of making visible the ways in which various ideologies operate within cultural space, in order not just to be like, yeah, there it is and it's a bummer, but to actually begin to think about what we might do collectively to think about making change. And in part, to me, that's important because of the very important and strange, maybe not strange, but very real condition that museums and cultural spaces kind of uncannily mirror the inequities in society. And so I have this hope, in part because I've spent over 20 years kind of embedded in these kinds of cultural spaces, that they can contribute to the larger society's ability to change itself, given what we're facing today. And so when I think about what's happening in Rojava, and when I've looked at the films and really thought, you know, there's something really necessary that needs to happen around the conversations that we're having, that should happen about how that change can actually be realized. So just to give a really specific example of something I'm working on, I've been talking with the Brooklyn Public Library about doing this thing we're calling the Art and Society Census that's coming up. The idea is to kind of create a questionnaire to engage people who normally wouldn't walk into a museum or don't really necessarily care about cultural spaces in that way, to kind of find out what people desire of cultural experiences, because I think we do have to have a much broader conversation than those of us who show up at e-flux or, you know, museums or cultural spaces for events like this, about, you know, what does it mean to think together, to be embodied in a space together and come up with ways of thinking that are not that perhaps are counter to the logics of the way that cultural space has evolved in the United States. So look out for news about that. It's kind of coming, and the idea is to create a questionnaire that we get into the hands of regular folks through the public library system and through the Brooklyn Public Schools, and to just kind of see what comes back, and then to create a series of working groups that kind of grow out of whatever we receive. So, you know, it's open-ended in the sense that we're not trying to overdetermine. We want to see what comes back first. And then people will be invited who participate in the questionnaires to participate in the working groups, to participate in making the selections. We're trying to decentralize it in a way that's hopefully will be effective and appealing.
It sounds like very bottoms up, very much in the in the structures of the small councils. I'd like to open it up to the audience because we're 5 more minutes. But I mean, if there are questions, I would rather that people ask questions than me mumbling. Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about how the West have fetishized Kurdish women and what are the kind of negative consequences?
Elif should have been here too. I mean, I'm not the perfect person to say that. Someone from the administration of Rojava would be the perfect person to answer this question. But to my understanding, women that have been over-portrayed in Western media because of their looks, and you know, good looks together with a Uzi gun or a Kalashnikov actually is quite a sight, have actually in fact been demoted in the army. So the way that they understand this fetishization is very much that it's objectifying women yet again, therefore they reject it. Women are extremely empowered. I mean, I think Janet is much more equipped to actually answer the question, having been there so many times and actually having spoken to them. But the way I understand it is that indeed the women that are in the army are extremely empowered, but also they follow a particular set of rules. So if these rules are, yeah.
See it, Janet. Yeah. You're next. So yes. So yeah, I was told in 2015 when I met with some YPJ people, some YPJ fighters, and also YPG, the People's Protection Units, that that the commanders were elected by the ranks. In other words, the democracy even extends into the militia itself. And I found this very interesting because Murray had written about similar things in the Spanish anarchist columns during the Spanish Revolution. But Murray would say, you know, but it didn't last. You know, after a while, you know, the pressures of warfare in the front, you know, they had to stop electing commanders, and it stopped being less bottom up, and it became much more traditional. So when I went there in this past April, one of my first questions to the YPJ and the YPG was, so do you still elect your commanders? And they said, well, of course. So in other words, so from, at least from 2000, well, no, when the YPJ was formed in, I think, 2013, and then up until April 2000, so for 6 years, it's lasted, the election of commanders has lasted. I think that's got to be some kind of marvel, a historical marvel. But yes, and the commanders, they live alongside. They're considered actually to have more responsibility. And if a commander proves to be not so great at her job, then there can be another election. But usually they're once a year. They're chosen once a year, and they can be reelected. The commanders do the same chores. They wash the dishes. They help cook the meals as the rank and file. So it's really quite the whole spirit of the militia. I don't want to say the military. The whole spirit of the militia is infused with the same kind of democracy that infuses the society. And I asked the YPJ commander that I interviewed, how do women fight as well as men? Are there particular ways that women fight? And she said, just the same, just the same. What about ethnicity? Because she said that in this particular YPJ academy where I was, there were Kurdish women learning Kurdish history. And she said, it's very important. You have to know your history so that you know what you're fighting for. And I found this to be true in the academies that Matt was talking about, and everywhere I went. It's not just a specialty. Someone won't just talk about economics. They'll talk about the whole history of the Kurdish people and the whole layout and cooperatives and the history of cooperatives and the theory of democratic confederalism, and then they'll also talk about economics. And the same thing is true in the military. They learn the ideologies. They learn genealogy. They learn the history of Kurdish women fighters. And I said, well, because so that they'll know what they're fighting for, so that they know who they are. I said, what about Arab women? They said they have their own. They learn the history of Arab women and also Syrian Christian women. They have their own understandings, their own education in the history. But I have to say, since I may not have another chance, that when the first years I was there was a lot of uncertainty about whether this experiment in interethnic democracy could last. There was a lot of mistrust, a lot of suspicion. When I went to an academy, like a military academy, the people would teach to the Kurds, no payback, no revenge. Yes, you've been oppressed by the Syrian Arab Republic. You've been oppressed by the Arabs for decades. But now that we have a little bit of power here in terms of our self-governments, there will be no payback. We will break the cycle of revenge. And I heard that in militia barracks. I heard that in the Asayish. We will break the cycle of revenge. And if you're a little skeptical about hearing that, I have to say a lot of us were a little skeptical about hearing that. Can that really work? And it's true that sometimes there were some individuals would go rogue. And that that a lot have been made of those. Well, Human Rights Watch made a big deal out of one episode of an individual that went rogue. But it's part of the education, it's part of the training, and especially as the war against ISIS, against Islamic State wore on, the different ethnicities came to understand that their future is tied together. They came to depend on each other militarily in battle, and they came to understand that their future in this region is interdependent. So just as men and women came to respect each other's fighting ability, the Arabs and the Kurds and the Christians came to respect each other's fighting ability. So when I'm sorry, I'm going on, but I'll just tell you one more thing. I went to an Arab commune in the Euphrates, right near the Euphrates River, and they told me about their hard life under Islamic State and how difficult it was, how brutal Islamic State was, how you couldn't smoke, you couldn't go out into. They were afraid even to go out into public with their families because the the child might say something that got them all decapitated, or the wife might say something. She said the worst thing was we learned to distrust our families. That's what Islamic State did to us. They made us distrust our families. But I said, well, we said, what about, so who liberated your village? Kurds and Arabs. Any difference? Oh, come on, don't even ask that. There's no difference between Arabs and Kurds. People just have to stop asking that. There's no difference. We understand, we understand. So I think, you know, it was just a beautiful sight in April 2019 to see how that inter-ethnic democracy and inter-ethnic cooperation really can work in the Middle East. So that by the time Turkey invaded, in October of 2019, everyone expected, oh, the Arabs will just desert. They'll just go over to, they'll just desert. They're not going to put their lives on the line for this. But it turns out they didn't. In fact, the SDF is now majority Arab. And they didn't desert. On the contrary, they're all there for keeping this system going. I've read this in interviews with Muslim Abdi, the general, the commander. Oh my gosh, it's just been, it's so, I think it's proof of the validity of this project and proof that this project can work as a model in northeastern Syria, in all of Syria, in all of the Middle East, and maybe in all of the world. So I wanted to make that point.
It is quickly, I wanted to talk about this idea of Western fetishization. The other thing that was really shocking when I first saw the films themselves is that they're clearly not made for the West. You know, they're made by themselves for each other, and this itself is a revolutionary thing, that they're not thinking about how do we explain ourselves to people who don't know what a Kurd is, how do we explain where we are, what the context is. They don't explain any of that because that's not what they're interested in, and it's really, I mean, that's really the question of autonomy, is producing a cinema for yourself, situated in its own place, and that's really what the films are, and that itself is revolutionary. And I think that directly addresses this question of Western fetishization, is to kind of ignore it or bypass it and really make their own films, to develop their own cinema culture that they want and they need.
Thank you so much for this, because that's exactly what it is. And I think it's actually asking us to somehow decolonize our own brain of how we understand film, or why would an international filmmaker make a film that we would immediately understand in order to be able to communicate. And that in itself also is, because it's de-Eurocentric, it's, you know, it's proposing something very, very different. I don't know if we have any yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for a very moving and inspiring presentation from all of you. I learned a lot. Thank you. I have one question. From watching the films downstairs, I particularly noted the quote about, my father always wanted to go back and lie down in the grass of the olive tree orchards. I was curious because obviously the environment is incredibly devastated and it's being tremendously impacted by climate change. Are any of these young people making films that are very specifically about what's happening to their ecology?
I mean, one of the pillars of the Rojava Revolution is ecology in any case. I mean, there are quite a few films that have been made that are related to traditional herbs, for instance, or to ways of cooking, or how to preserve, how do you call them, plants, etc., etc. So yes, but again, their questioning in terms of climate catastrophe is not one that we have here. It's a completely different understanding of it. And also, I mean, again, Matt and Janet are more equipped to answer it because they have been there. But to my understanding, and from the descriptions of the friends and the commune itself, building is not extreme, you know, pollution is in different scales. We're not talking about a Western idea of a huge city with factories that are, you know, destroying everything. It's a different type. I mean, I can say also that for Greece as well. It's in a different scale somehow. We're in Greece now in 2020, we're having fracking for the first time ever. So in order for us to come to the question or the level of society being involved with fracking being a bad thing, we should stop it, I think it's going to be a decade and then obviously very, very late. I don't know if Matt or Janet want to add something on that, but I mean, yes, they do, but in a different way than what we would expect. No questions? One more question, last one.
Thank you. Two questions. One is really quick. Do we know of any direct correspondence between Murray Bookchin and Abdullah Öcalan, number one? And number two, Janet, you mentioned earlier kind of that there are a few differences between Bookchin's project and Öcalan's project, and I was just wondering if you could talk to that.
So, yes, so there was a correspondence not between them directly. So first of all, Öcalan doesn't know English and Murray didn't know Turkish or Kurdish. But in April of 2004, some German solidarity activists, it was their idea actually, thought it would be a good idea for Bookchin and Öcalan to have a dialogue, if that's possible, because they knew Öcalan had been reading Bookchin's work and was recommending it to the comrades. And so they organized, they tried to organize a debate, and there were some messages that went back and forth between Öcalan on the island, through his lawyers, through the German solidarity activists, and then to who knew English, and then to Murray and also to me. So, yeah, he said Öcalan said that he was very interested in Murray's work. He said the upshot of it was he considered himself a good student of Murray's. Those were the words that were translated, and also he considered himself a social ecologist. Social ecology is the name of Bookchin's ideology, so to speak. And in terms of a dialogue, Murray was by that time very disappointed and very disheartened and ill, and he wasn't in a position to really have a dialogue at that point. He was, to tell you the truth, in retrospect, I so wish I'd pushed him. Oh my. But you know, he was very, very disheartened and discouraged, and so he commended Mr. Öcalan for his interest in social ecology, and he said that I think the Kurdish people are in good hands now that you are able to teach them about how to create bottom-up democracy, but that of course didn't stop Mr. Öcalan from going on and developing democratic confederalism. And by the time Murray died in July of 2006, his ideas were familiar enough amongst the Kurdish movement that the PKK assembly issued a beautiful tribute. It's the best obituary he could have imagined. A great, like, 6-page, single-spaced tribute to the great social scientists of the 20th century who taught us that Marxism was wrong and who taught us to love ecology and democracy. And they closed by saying, we pledge that we will build the first society based on Bookchin's ideas on the planet, and sure enough, they did. So, like I say, implementation. It was just beautiful. Right. So yeah, as I said, Bookchin was opposed to all hierarchy, and Öcalan singled out the domination of women as supremely. He gave it primacy, and said that was supremely important to overcome. I think that was a very good move on his part. I think it was absolutely right. It was an improvement, especially in that context. The other thing, another thing was that I've been thinking about this lately. That another phrase, in addition to democratic confederalism, he called it democratic autonomy, and I've always puzzled in my mind, how does that work? First of all, why the two phrases, and what does he mean by democratic autonomy? And then I realize that this is me here, sitting in the United States. We don't have to think about autonomy, because this is the empire. You know, I mean, these are in the Middle East, a place with such a history of colonialism. It's not just a matter of creating democracy, but it's democracy autonomously from the ruling powers, autonomously from the colonial powers, and also autonomously from the nation states that have dictated have tried to suppress it. And that's not something that I think Murray, also writing in the privileged West, I don't think that was so much in his consciousness. But I think in the Middle East, democracy has to be linked with autonomy. You know, I was just actually recently reading something about Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the prime minister of Iran in 1953, the one that the CIA overthrew. And he was also an intellectual. So this was in the early 1950s. I was reading something about his ideas, and he too, he wanted to bring democracy and autonomy to Persia, or to Iran. It was being called Iran by then. And he didn't mean bottom-up democracy like Bookchin did. But even in the sense of being in Iran, in that context, he too was conjoining those two words that Öcalan conjoined. And that really helped me see through my position of privilege here and understand that they really do belong together, those two words in the Middle East. And so that was, I think, a very important change that he made. So.
Okay. Well, thank you all very, very, very much.